Hello folks, welcome to my basement recording office, normally my grading spot, but now much more of a place to talk to my students and in this case to my friends or anybody else who might be interested. I have been thinking a lot about how it will be in the future to be a historian and try to study the great pandemic of 2020. And I've been thinking, I know my daughter started to keep a diary. She's trying to get all her friends to keep diaries. I made a few notes myself, especially in the week of the kind of 12th, 13th or so, trying to understand my own, keep track of how my own understanding of the situation had evolved day by day, sometimes hour by hour. Why me talking to you about this? My son, who's probably the one that you hear in the background practicing piano upstairs, has often described me as a fire disaster historian, and sometimes he laughs a little bit. But it's kind of true. The last chapter, and possibly the best chapter in terms of being published as an article a lot of people read, of my first book was about the disaster of the earthquake of 1906 in Valparaiso in Chile, and all the conflict that went into the reconstruction process afterwards. And earlier in the same project, I had studied fire regulations, fire situations generally, and the fire department and so on. And for the last 17 years, almost every year, I've taught a course called Disasters in Modern Society. I have read as many good to mediocre, depending on the student, papers about particular disasters in different parts of the world at different times in history, probably as anybody else has. And particularly from the good papers and from the readings that I cycle through that course, have picked up quite a few ideas about how disasters work and how societies respond to them. I haven't produced a detailed study of social or government response to disasters in general, partly because I'm a historian and that's not what we do, and partly because my research interests were taking me in other directions. But I've done a lot of teaching and thinking about this. And because I've written about disasters, I know what kinds of sources were easy to find and what kind of sources were difficult to find and what kinds of sources I couldn't find but wished that I had. So I've got a few sample sources from different disasters. I'm going to make some comments about which ones are perhaps the most valuable to save if you're hoping that in 10 or 20 or 50 years you have a box that you could give to a historical society or something like that, and have scholars eventually, or journalistic historians or whoever, look into it and say, aha, here is material that I could have found nowhere else. So, you won't be able to read these, but that's okay. This comes from an archive. It's a photocopy of a prospectus for creating a volunteer fire department in Santiago, Chile in the 1820s. It didn't happen. They didn't actually establish a fire department until after a tremendously deadly fire in a church 40 years later in 1863. More than 2,200 people may have died in that fire, maybe as many as 2,500. I published an article about that and how it was covered in the news in a magazine called History Today. You can easily look it up online if you're curious, just to sort of understand how I work as a scholar. So somebody saved this. This looks like it was entered in an archives, but it looks like it was a handbill that was meant to be hung up. An equivalent today might be if you saw an interesting notice on the front of the school or front of the store and want to take a picture of it and then later print that picture out and stick it in a box. You could try to save it electronically, but paper will last for centuries and be able to be read without special equipment, so it's probably better to keep documents like this on paper. I happened to be in Chile in 2010 when there was a tremendous earthquake. It wasn't too tremendous where we lived, but certainly extremely noticeable, could not stand up while it was happening, and did some destruction in the city where we were. It was much more destructive elsewhere. So I saved a bunch of newspapers. You may be able to see here, it's a picture of a ship washed up on shore by a tsunami. Now, this is a fun thing to have. I have a stack of them. I use them in class. Will future historians be using my stash of newspapers? Probably not. Most likely, unless society totally changes, there'll be libraries that have these in digital form, or possibly they'll still go on microfilming, maybe bind the things and keep them. So these kind of published sources that are also also include official information are fine for you to save if you want to be able to show your kids, look, this was the newspaper. They might think that was interesting if they're that sort of person, if that attracts them. But it won't be that unique. So if you're thinking of how do I help the historians of the future, think of things that are perhaps a little more unique. In the same category, I am sure that the text of this little flyer that we got in the mail about COVID-19 will never be lost. But your grandchildren might enjoy seeing it someday in the future. So I've got a list here. Hopefully people can see. It says sources. Then there are, I've just put three oppositions, three kind of dichotomies of types of sources. There are the official sources, and there are the personal sources. And maybe I should say official, institutional, corporate sources. So the kind of government records, whether they're published or not published, company records, newsletters issued by universities, all these things are in that official source category. And then there are the personal sources, which in the case of my research has often been letters that people wrote, although once it was a poem that someone wrote that tremendously helped me to understand how at least one person and his publisher felt about the aftermath of the earthquake in Valparaiso because of this poem about the military, the naval officer who was in charge of martial law. But that was a very personal source, and I was glad, as it turned out, it had been published, but still it's very personal, and I was glad to have it. But also, it's wonderful if you find somebody's diary, somebody's letters. Today it might be somebody's email, somebody who goes through Facebook and copies out their favorite posts that they made, or from their friends, or from any other social media. Zuckerberg and social media know everything about us, but I don't think we can expect them to save it in a searchable form 50 years from now. The track record of electronic sources still being available even a decade down the road is actually pretty dismal for things that aren't constantly in use. The state of Maine has lost a whole chunk of government records from 15, 20 years ago because they just forgot to maintain the media. And many other things exist but are hard to read because the software to read them is no longer commonly in use and so on. So archive stuff off of Facebook if you want, and this sort of thing. Somebody sends you interesting emails, throw them all in a folder, paste them into a file when the whole thing is over, and it will be. We're going to survive this, most of us. We're going to get through this. Print out that file and store it with whatever clippings you might have had in mind. Then there are sources that are published and sources that are unpublished. Now think about it, the published sources are generally going to be more widely available because there will have been many copies made. Whereas unpublished sources, these are, again, the letters, the diaries, and so on. Published sources show kind of some professional opinion, usually, or the opinion of someone in some sort of position of power or authority, whether it's because they have money or because of what their job is or what. Unpublished sources may show that, and they may show it more honestly because it's not the facade being put on by an institution or a person. But unpublished sources may also come from ordinary people. And it's always a challenge for historians to try to understand what ordinary people thought. Hopefully somebody will archive the comments from YouTube and the comment fields from some newspapers so that we can read through and see what ordinary people were arguing about under the articles. My students laugh when I send them to the comments. I'll have them watch a video of a video of a Mexican song about oil nationalization and then tell them, let's read the comments and see what Mexicans have to say about this 1930s oil policy today. And actually actually you can learn quite a lot, because if people are getting in there with these very political comments. And somebody will have to slog through those comment fields if they've been saved. I wouldn't suggest that you try to archive them. I'm just recognizing that the official sources may have unofficial sources attached to them that will help us know what ordinary people think. Saving the published sources is much less of a preservation issue. You're not going to be the one with the only copy of the Chicago Tribune from tomorrow. It seems extremely unlikely that that would happen, and your copy will not be easy to find or use, and if you keep it folded up, it'll probably fall apart. But you might be the person with the only copy of what you thought, what your father said to you, what your mother told you, what your daughter said, and so on. Pictures. Pictures of ordinary streets and ordinary parks and ordinary homes, as opposed to pictures of iconic locations near the newspaper offices where the photographers tend to go. These can be very valuable, pictures of ordinary people. And if you don't believe that pictures of ordinary people can be valuable, here's a story from World War II that some of you may know, that the British intelligence services wanted to come up with the best landing plans they could for invading France. And in order to compile pictures of the coast, they just put ads in the newspapers, maybe on the radio, that said, if you have any postcards or holiday photographs or paintings, or just any images of the French coast, the Belgian coast, the Dutch coast, they were didn't want anybody to know where they were, didn't say of Normandy, so they said of the whole coast, please mail them to us. I don't know if people got them back, but they got millions of images. And from that, they were able to get something almost as good as a Google Earth view, as a Google Street view of what the coast looked like, and they used that to plan the invasions. Ordinary people's individual pictures made a difference. And that could happen in the future of studying this. There's another distinction which is between the intentional sources and the unintentional sources. I made this up. These are not official historian terms of art or anything. So, if you look at the idea of intentional and unintentional sources, this could make a difference to you. Intentional sources are, in my mind, diaries, ship's logs, documents that have been made on purpose to tell people in the future about the time in which they were made. Whereas unintentional sources would be everything else. Your gas bill, a letter from your boss, your brother, your sister, your granddaughter, your grandmother, a picture out your window that you took in order to send to your friend across town to show what it looks like, letters that you perhaps had written to the editor, a poem that you wrote just because you felt like it, things that you weren't necessarily thinking of as a document for the future. So if you're not particularly a writer, you don't really feel like keeping a journal or a diary, so don't try to create intentional sources. Think about collecting unintentional sources. That interesting letter, email, note of a phone call, picture that your kid drew about being cooped up in the house and in the yard for a long time. Anything along those lines. Hang on to those. Particularly if you get a mailing from a small institution, or you happen to get a receipt which somehow is useful for understanding the pandemic. Anything of that nature. Just take them, stick them in a box, and away you go. Those would be the unintentional sources. Sometimes the unintentional sources reveal surprising things. The records of various court cases in pre-industrial and industrial England revealed that in pre-industrial England people slept more and at different times of night. And they did this in a kind of doubly unintentional way. A historian who wanted to study sleep went and looked in the reports of crimes to see whether the witnesses said they had been awake or asleep when they kind of heard screaming, something like that. So that whether they were awake or asleep was more or less immaterial to the case. Nobody had any incentive to lie or conceal what was going on there. Usually unintentional sources are not quite that kind that special reliability that those did. But still, they are equally useful as intentional sources, and perhaps less likely to be either saved or easily accessible to the historian. So the unique unintentional sources could be quite a good thing in the future. And then, when this is over, because it will be, package these things up with any commentary you might have, put them aside, and maybe keep saving sources. And then someday you'll have a box of papers. The Samuel Martland papers would probably fill many linear yards at this point, as archives and libraries often measure these collections in linear feet, linear yards, linear meters, how much space they take up, spread out on the shelf. And you can hand it over, and someday somebody might look and see, this historical society has 7 linear inches of documents pertaining to the great COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. And then you will have helped historians for the future. And why should you do this? If you're interested in history, of course, why not? If you're trying to claim a little immortality for yourself, get your name in a book 50 years from now, again, why not? Those are great. But there are also practical uses. For example, Eric Kleinenberg, a few years ago, decided to do a study of the great heat wave of Chicago in 1995, in which a large number of people died. And he's a sociologist, and he wanted to find out why had more people died in some neighborhoods than others. Why, in fact, had more elderly white people died in certain neighborhoods than in others. And he was able mostly to do this by interviewing people to find out what it was about those certain neighborhoods where people had a better chance of living and certain neighborhoods where people had a better chance of dying. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was dynamic neighborhoods with lots of new people moving in and lots of investment in them that tended to have a better survival rate for the new residents and for the original or older residents of the neighborhood. In the case of Chicago, this was mostly Latinx neighborhoods, which in Chicago were the urban neighborhoods that were having influxes of population and people starting new businesses and so on, which in a heat wave gave essentially elderly white people from earlier generations who aged in place in those neighborhoods, gave them a place to go, a barbershop to go to cool off, a store or something. Whereas in other neighborhoods of the city that have been abandoned and disinvested from the mostly largely African American neighborhoods suffering really from serious institutional racism, the white people who lived in those neighborhoods had also had poor health outcomes because the infrastructure for going out to cool off if your apartment warmed up too much, for having friends who would check on you, for just having anyone who would notice if you were doing okay, wasn't there in those neighborhoods. How did Kleinenberg figure that out? By interviewing people. But 30 years later, he wouldn't have been able to interview a lot of the people. And if a historian were trying to do that in the future, they would need a collection of just people's notes, memories, diaries, communications with each other that got saved to say what it was like to be living in any one of those neighborhoods. So these historical pieces of information can have a real practical use. People trying to understand how to fight the next big pandemic, hopefully not for quite a long time, will be able to look at records from this one and at records from the daily lives of ordinary people to find out how we did it. How did we keep ourselves at home for a month or 6 weeks or whatever it took? How did we keep from breaking down, going over to visit our relatives? How did we survive when many people couldn't go to work? How did we convince the employers and the government to pay people to stay home and not work? Because that was the best thing they could possibly do. What did people say in their families about how this ought to work and how they should relate to their neighbors? All of this information will be useful in the future so that people can know how this one worked. Not just what the official proclamations were, not just what came out in the news, but how it actually worked. So that next time, or the time after that, they'll have some hints over how to do this better. And for now, thinking about and collecting these documents can give you something to do at home. So this can be something for us to do. And it's a thing we can do because we can help in the future. And by doing it rather than going and meeting somebody, we can help now as well.